Welcome, everyone, whoever you are and wherever you find yourself on your journey of faith, and wherever you find yourself this morning. It is so wonderful to have you here as part of All Saints Church online church. We are learning how to do so many things in different ways. First of all, my name is Mike Kinman. My pronouns are he, him. I'm the rector of All Saints Church. It's great to have you all here. We're learning to do many, many things in different ways. We had a rector's forum scheduled for this morning on an incredibly important topic, and that's the census. And we said we still need to do this, and so we're moving it online. And so we'll get to that in a few seconds. Juliana Serrano is going to be running this forum. Want to just say a couple things. First of all, just to remind you that the orders of staying at home as you have a home are in place. They're incredibly important for you to abide by. You'll see me, I'm actually in my office at All Saints right now because my internet at home was not working, and I'm the only person in the building here. So I'm isolating in a different place this morning. Please stay where you are except for essential errands. And if you need someone to run errands for you or things like that, please let us know, reach out to us. If home is not a safe place for you, let us know. You can call the you can let us know, and you can also call the National Domestic Violence Hotline. I'm going to put that number in the chat right now. That's 1-800-799-7233. You can text "Love Is" to 22522, or you can log on to the hotline.org, and here's all that information in the chat. Also, for LGBTQ youth, if you are in crisis or just need someone to talk to, the Trevor Project hotline is 866-488-7386. We are, in the midst of all of the things that are happening in our world right now, we still have an incredibly important event going on, and that is the 2020 census. Many of you have received, I hope most of you have received, if you have a place to live, a letter at your home about this. We have gathered a great team of panelists to talk about the census and to invite us into engagement in that in many ways. And with that, I just want to turn it over to our Senior Associate for Peace and Justice and Director of the Office of Creative Connections, Juliana Serrano. And Juliana, why don't you take it from here and help us understand more about the census.
Great. Thanks, Mike. I'm really excited that there are 88 participants this morning. This is a wonderful opportunity to get to talk to you all about the census, and I'm so delighted that we still have this medium, even though we can't physically be together in a rector's forum at All Saints Church. To create this virtual space to have this important conversation means the world to me. And I'm so incredibly grateful for our panelists who had probably since the end of January, when I came up with this idea of doing a rector's forum, agreed to do this forum. And when I reached out about a week or two ago and said, hey, we've got this stay-at-home order, and I still want for us to do this forum, would you be willing to do a Zoom with us? They all said yes. And so I'm so grateful for our panelists, which will introduce themselves in just a moment. I do just want to briefly go over what our format will be. We will end at 10:45, and so my hope is to spend about 30 minutes or so asking some questions of our panelists, and then we will open it up to you all for questions as well. And so my hope is that when the time comes that you will use that Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen to submit a question, and then I will do my best to field that to a particular panelist to whom that might be a most appropriate question, if you don't direct that question to a particular person in that Q&A function. So this is a huge triumph for us. Thank you all for being patient, especially those of you who had logged on a little early and were hearing kind of all of our technical talk. We are learning so much as a result of this, and it's exciting and new, and still a great medium for us, again, to get together and learn. So with that, I would love now to introduce our panelists. And if our panelists could please turn on their cameras and also their audio, that would be great. So we have Chapman Clark, Norma Rodriguez, and Kim Douglas. Yay, good to see you all. Thank you so much for being with us. Maybe if we can just begin with Chap and then go to Norma and Kim, if you could please introduce yourselves to the audience, tell us a little bit about the organization that you represent and how you and your organization are involved with the 2020 census.
Yeah, thank you, Juliana. My name is Chapman Clark Jr. I am an organizer and a social worker with LA Voice. LA Voice is a multi-faith, multiracial community organizing group. We represent 60 plus congregations and faith-based organizations throughout LA County. And we've been partnering with many more communities throughout LA County and faith traditions to get access and participation into the census. So really glad to be here and to have a chance to talk with you and your community. Honored as a member, as an employee of LA Voice, to get to talk to the local All Saints community. We also have been organizing and hosting nonprofits to get involved in the San Gabriel Valley through the We Count LA County census effort. So one of the things I'm able to talk about is not just our approach as LA Voice and our faith-based institutions getting involved in census, but also what's happening kind of more largely across the nonprofit engagement with census efforts. So would love to answer questions and really glad to be here. I'll turn it over. Thanks.
Norma, will you introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Norma Rodriguez. I am Manager of Public Affairs for Planned Parenthood Pasadena, San Gabriel Valley. So our organization, as you know, provides reproductive health care and sex education throughout the San Gabriel Valley. It's a kind of a wide swath of the San Gabriel Valley that we service, and we've been in this census work for about a little over a year, just planning how we will do our outreach, because we understand that the patients that we serve tend to fall into the hard to count categories of people in our communities. And so we're kind of ramping up our efforts now, especially in light of everything that's going on with the public health crisis that we're facing, have had to pivot, but we're still very committed to making sure that this work continues and that we get an accurate count for the census, because it's so vital to the health of our community. So we've also been part of the We Count LA Coalition, working with partner groups such as All Saints and LA Voice and a bunch of others doing work around census in the San Gabriel Valley. So I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And that's it.
Thank you, Norma. Good morning, Kim.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Kimberly Douglas, and aside from being an usher at All Saints, I am also co-chair, along with Lawrence Anang, of POP, a social justice advocacy group here in Pasadena called Pasadenans Organizing for Progress. And we were involved in the 2015 minimum wage campaign. And since then, work on other aspects of workers' rights, as well as police practices, especially use of force and discriminatory behavior, and immigrant rights and housing. So with that mandate, clearly the census, we realized early on, it was appropriate for us to get involved and help with the outreach, particularly to the undercounted communities that largely are in the northwest area of Pasadena. And to that end, I've participated in the city's Complete Counts Committee since early fall. This is a group brought together by city staff, Mark Chomsky, the city clerk, and Michelle Pereira, the city director of libraries, and non-governmental organizations, as well as faith communities, to coordinate and plan the census outreach. And there you go.
Great. Thanks, Kim. Well, I do think it would be great just to start with some basics, right? So, Chap, I'm wondering if you can tell us, what is the census? What are its origins? How does this nation decide that it wants to do a count of its people?
Yeah. So the census is basically that. It's just a count of the nation. I've heard it called the nation selfie, which I think is kind of a helpful image. It's really a way to understand our communities, who is in our community, the different folks that we interact with. So there's some technical, some tactical, and some practical reasons why we do the census. And that ties into the history, not just in the US, but in our faith communities. It goes back to the book of Numbers, and trying to understand populations and what was needed as folks moved into the promised land. So it's important to not kind of like glaze over as we hear just kind of like the idea of a count. It's one of the most important issues in the history of our country. Actually, the great civil rights attorney Michael Waldman from the Brenner Center said census in the year of 2020 was one of the greatest civil rights issues of our day. So the history and what the census is, it really connects to our political representation and how the federal funding gets disseminated back to our communities. We'll talk a little bit more about how the census works, but it really, that capture, that community selfie determines so much of our political futures and our community representation and well-being. The history of the census, it's been going on for a very long time. It happens every 10 years, and it always has been fraught with undercount. Historically, there's been an undercount of vulnerable populations and an error of up to millions of communities of color. So that includes hard to count communities that are non-English speaking, poor, urban, and rural. It's really important to think about the census in terms of supporting folks kind of in their needs, also with their desires to build and determine how they want to use resources to plan for futures and to plan to incorporate data to make informed decisions for planning, for services, for education. So that's kind of what the census is. Historically, it's important also to recognize that the census data has been used to further marginalize people going back into World War II. So there are concerns looking at the history of the US Census, and our community needs to be voicing to each other the importance and also the safety that we have in numbers as we understand the issues in front of us, especially given the pandemic and the digital challenges. We'll get into more of those things later, but that's kind of like the history and the context of what the census is right now.
So Chap, can you tell us a little bit then about the timeline? Because you did mention this happens every 10 years in our nation. Can you tell us, when the census gets started and when it's complete? Mike had mentioned at the beginning that hopefully folks should have received something in the mail already. What is sort of the timeline for events for our nation around the census?
Yeah, actually, we are convening now, just right before National Census Day. So April 1st is across this country, nonprofits, governments, elected officials, and media will all be letting people know that today is a day to take action and to go online and fill out your census form. So it's great to be on this call now and to be helping people understand kind of the importance and what's at stake. Like you said, Juliana, everyone should have received at least their first mailing with their census code. It's important to know that you don't need that code to complete your census form. So really at this point, every single person in this country can go online right now and complete the census. And we're in that process of letting communities know to go ahead and do that. The timeline going forward, there's a series of processes that the Census Bureau itself utilizes to make sure the count happens. Now, a lot of those processes happen in the field. They happen door-to-door knocking. That's called the non-response follow-up timeline. The non-response follow-up timeline typically starts after self-enumeration, after people take the opportunity to fill out the census on their own. So that timeline is now extended because of the situation we're in. The Census Bureau itself will not be, at this point, will not be interacting with the public until mid-April. This is the second extension we've seen. So as opposed to getting into like what the timeline really is in terms of dates, I'd like to think about it kind of more generally and kind of more like fluidly. At some point, the Census Bureau will use a $13 billion budget and send out 500,000 people to count folks and to support our efforts with nonprofits of local communities. First, they will start with what's called large group enumeration, and they will go to places where big bulks of people reside, whether that's senior homes, universities, and unsheltered kind of communities. And then they'll move into the non-response follow-up and help people, help to contact people who haven't responded online on their own. That timeline we don't know about, but given the pushback of everything, we believe that operations will be happening in the field by the Census Bureau up until August, and that community-based organizations, faith communities, can be helping neighbors to participate in the census all the way into July. And that calendar might be extended. So it's important right now to count yourself and to talk to your friends and family. But then in the future, it's going to be really important from now till July to find ways to engage people who haven't done this yet. And I think that's kind of the calendar and timeline.
Great, thanks. That's super helpful. Norma, I'd love to ask you a couple questions as well. I'm wondering if you can tell us more specifically about who is asked to participate in the census, how, what are the different forms of participation, and I think Chap got a little bit into that, but if you could expand. And then also, could you give us some example of questions that are asked in the census survey?
Sure. So everyone who lives in the United States is eligible and required to fill out the census, irregardless of immigration status or housing status. If you are a live person residing in the United States, you should fill out the census and be counted. And so the question of, who's eligible, who's required is really broad, like we all are, including children. Oftentimes people have this, in the past have had this misconception that kids and babies are not to be counted or don't need to be included in that household survey. And so in previous census, there has been a serious undercount of small children and babies, which ultimately, leads to school funding issues. And so it's really important that everyone of all ages get counted. In terms of the types of questions that are included, they are really basic, easy questions. If all of us have filled out forms before and are used to answering questions such as our name, our address, and that's really what's included. I've already filled out my form and it took me maybe 5 minutes to include both of my children and other people living in my household. The questions are, there is a question on race and also the person's, the participant's relationship to the head of household. Whoever fills out the form is considered the head of household. It's not really an official designation. It's just if your name appears first. Subsequent questions will refer to that person's relationship to the head of household. So if I'm head of household and I put my daughter down, her relationship to me is daughter, vice versa. So the form is super simple. And like I said, depending on how many people live in your household, it will determine whether it takes you 5 or 10 minutes, perhaps. And then I forget the other part of your question. There was a third part.
No, I think that's good. And then I do want to ask a follow-up, but I want to share also that I did my census, and it probably took me 3 minutes, given that I'm single, I live alone, I had nobody else to survey to account for. It was super quick, super easy. It's not even like you need to go get some sort of paperwork and have it by your side in order to fill out the survey or anything. You can just fill it out from, the information that you know on the top of your head, which, I was actually expecting it to take a little bit longer, but it did not, and I was surprised. And so I think that even if you have additional people living in your household, I would easily imagine that it wouldn't take very much time at all. Norma, I would love for you to share with us, though, what happens to the data? So the government is collecting all this information about us. What then happens with that information that we share with the government about our households?
Okay, yes. So census data is used for a bunch of stuff that it directly impacts our communities. For example, in the end, it's a pot of about 800 billion federal dollars that get allocated throughout communities in this country. And census data is used to determine how much each community gets, essentially. And so things like Medicaid uses census data programs such as the Title X program, which is a program to help low-income people receive reproductive health care services. So any kind of federal program will use census data to determine funding allocations. So school lunch programs, senior centers, hospitals, other public services, roads, it's incredible, like how powerful this data set is. And so if you think about direct impact to communities, it's for 10 years, it's going to determine how much money communities like the ones Planned Parenthood serves receive in federal money. And so it directly translates into services available, into the quality of our schools, into the overall vibrancy and health of our communities. And so that's why it's so vital that every single person make sure that they're docked and that they are counted. So to answer your question further, and almost as importantly, census data is also determined to do redistricting for congressional districts. And so it also has political implications for our communities. It will determine the number of representatives that we have in Congress to go and represent our interests. And so, beyond sort of the public service aspect of this data, it also has really, especially in this political climate that we're in, we need representatives who are in line with our values and who understand our communities and are there to stand up for our communities. And so the congressional districts is a huge part of census data. And so if that doesn't motivate us, to make sure that we fill out that form. Anyway, so.
Yeah. And Norma, forgive me if you did mention this earlier, because I'm sorry, my internet connection was delayed a little bit. And so I didn't hear you for a second, but I'm wondering if you can speak to confidentiality of data, because I know that's a major concern for folks. And in particular, there's been a lot of concern from the undocumented members of our community about how this data might get utilized. Can you speak a little to that, please?
Sure, definitely. Yeah, this is a really important issue that has kind of been going through the courts and has been kind of at the forefront of the Census Bureau's minds and groups doing census outreach, which is that back in 2019, the Trump administration was petitioning to include a citizenship question on the census form. And in light of his approach to immigration policy, obviously for vulnerable populations and for folks who are living really in the shadows of our communities, it felt like a very sinister, attempt to make sure that immigrant populations are fearful and that they remain in the shadows. And so it kind of was a long trajectory, long series of events. But ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled that the census question could not appear on the census form for 2020. At one point, the Trump administration was saying that they wanted the census question, the citizenship question to appear to protect the Voting Rights Act. There are all sorts of interesting justifications to, attempt to get this question on. And so thankfully, it was not successful. Those efforts weren't successful. The question will not appear. It does not appear. However, I think it did a lot of damage. Anyway, people are still scared. There's huge mistrust of the federal government. And so it was, even though it legally did not, succeed, I think it did succeed to a point. And so, unfortunately, that's the work that we're doing at the community level is now having to kind of regain that ground and convince people that their census data is confidential, it is safe. The government cannot use your data to identify you. The data set that the Census Bureau turns over to the federal government is aggregate data. There is no personal identifying information. Your name will not appear in that data set. It is a count. It is only a count. And so just having to convince people and that they understand that it is safe, it is confidential. Title 13 of the US Tax Code protects that, that information and that confidentiality. Census Bureau employees take a sworn oath that they will protect the privacy of all of Americans and anybody living in this country. And so, there is a federal statute that protects that information as well. And so,
no, because I appreciate you just saying right now that it's aggregate data, right? That even though we as households, as individuals are filling out this information, that the way the government ends up seeing it is in aggregate, right? And I think that does provide a certain sense of peace of mind, I think, that, it's not like Juliana Serrano, who lives at this address, has this, happening, and they're looking at the data in that way, that it's more about what's happening here in Pasadena. And so maybe to transition into what's happening in Pasadena, Kim, I would love for you to talk about this notion, and I think Chap mentioned it earlier, around hard to count communities. And I think that inevitably includes members of our undocumented community, as Norma was talking about the damage that had been done around the possibility of having asked the question about citizenship status. Kim, can you tell us a little bit about what has been going on here in Pasadena and what efforts are underway to specifically get a count of those hard to count community members?
Yes, well, this is the virus is catastrophic, actually, in terms of the plans that were made to reach out to the hard to count community. It can be described as basically a community that is distrustful, fearful, as Norma pointed out, and the characteristics are renters, low-income families, foreign-born, non-family households, those who are either largely not informed or even aren't particularly, or do not feel particularly connected to the larger social sphere. And the established approach to overcome those feelings of distrust and fear is to connect in an intimate manner within the neighborhoods by going door to door, stopping in at popular local businesses such as beauty parlors, barbershops, laundromats, and holding more local get-togethers with local leaders that the community recognizes and would trust, because the message has to come from a trusted entity and trusted within that community. So two areas. One is to educate them about, to reach out and educate them about how the census data is used. I mean, Pasadena get $70 million for their public schools, $50 million for health programs, $11 million alone for WIC, and of course, housing subsidies, $100 million. So for them to understand that, so that they're incentivized or want to contribute their household information. In Pasadena, there are about 15 census tracts that are rated as highly undercounted. And that amounts to about 70,000 people. So the issue to reach and encourage those residents to still submit their household information is absolutely critical. So the efforts right now, given our stay-at-home order until at least April 19th, is through social media. PSA announcements as best we can to promote and boost through social media sites, Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, etc. For example, on February 24th at the City Council meeting, Pablo Alvarado, the Executive Director of Endelon, showed PSAs that they developed in Spanish and English, in which the individuals largely from the Pasadena Job Center, but people who live in the community spoke about the need to contribute their census information, but also why and how. And Mark Chomsky, the city clerk, said that the city would also be using and promoting those PSAs. So, and before the shutdown, POP, with city support, had planned events at Community Arms Apartments on Orange Grove and Kings Village's residences on North Fair Oaks to anchor our outreach to those neighborhoods in the Northwest Pasadena. Obviously, they were canceled. However, the plan is to reschedule them once the stay-at-home order is lifted. And the city too had to cancel events that were, for example, at Villa Park, and hopefully they will also be rescheduled. And as Chap mentioned, the Census Bureau has extended the counting period 2 weeks until August 14th, so we'll have to make the most of it. But one other aspect of this is that we know the undercounted communities largely do not have broadband access in their homes, but most people do have a phone. And the Census Bureau has put out a list of phone numbers by language that individuals can use to call in and answer the questions in their native language over the phone. And you can use any phone. It doesn't have to be the phone that you give in the census questionnaire, any phone. And to reach and encourage people and to make it easier, often in some communities, the people are more interested in talking to someone than filling out a form. And so by talking to someone who's asking the questions in a language they're familiar with and comfortable with certainly enhances it. So we can't do enough to promote those phone numbers, I think.
Thanks. Yeah, that's super important. And I'm so aware, being connected to POP and knowing well the attempts that POP was making to reach out to those hard to count communities in order to encourage participation, that has all now been stunted by this stay-at-home order and by the coronavirus pandemic that we're experiencing. But my hope is that mechanisms like this Zoom, which is being recorded, that we can share that with other community members, and that all 131 participants that are on the Zoom right now will not only fill out the census themselves, but encourage, their friends, their family members, their colleagues at work to fill out the census as well, so that we make sure that everyone in our community is counted. But on that note, I would love to then circle back to Chap. And Chap, if you could just, offer a suggestion. What is it that folks listening, watching today, what can people do to support the Census 2020?
Yeah, Thank you to all the panelists for the really wonderful information. And Kim, in particular, it's really like amazing to hear how some of the grassroots kind of like connective work has been happening through POP. LA Voice is really unique in that we aren't the actual like organizers in a certain community. We really like work to support organizers in their communities that are kind of decentralized throughout the county. So what that means is we're really trying to enhance and develop the capacity of groups to get involved digitally and online. A big challenge for us are most of our communities are those that are considered hard to count. So how do we help those congregations not just pivot their conversations about census, but how do they pivot into a digital era? We're trying to work with communities to get access to internet, to streaming their services, but also to some very basic kind of trainings. And I think this is really important, not just for the congregations and clergy we work with, but also for the leaders and the volunteers at our congregations. So this is an important invitation to all of you that are here. How do we build our network? How do we continue to embrace the technology that we have access to and create pockets of conversations and convenings so that information can be moved through those channels? As we're all being forced to adapt to this time of social distancing, we can create conversations around our needs and about what we're going through and meet people in those spaces and talk about the important issues that are coming up. Census is a very, very big issue related to our community funding, our long-term sustainability and well-being. There's some other really, really big issues going on right now. What that means is there's an opportunity to talk about both things and how they impact each other, and to really do some education on what we're facing as a community with our needs currently and how census is a part of that. We hope that by growing that network and our connection to each other, we'll be able to invite people to take action more effectively. Some of the action that we would like to be doing virtually, not just convening groups like this on Zoom or on Facebook Live, but also some like peer-to-peer texting your friends, letting them know about census, letting people know where to go if they have questions or if they need support, how to share those phone numbers that Kim talked about with all the different language resources. So we'd love for you to be a part of LA Voice, to plug in to our Belong network. There's a number of ways to do that. There will be social media toolkit, there will be memes, and you'll see a lot of these things coming from our partners as well. Their materials, it's really like an important thing to do right now is to support the nonprofits and communities that are talking to hard to count through our own kind of community development. So we would love for you to follow LA Voice on social media for access to some of those tools. We'll be setting up some virtual phone banks to call people. There's lots of ways to get involved. You can also email me, chap@LA Voice, for any kind of instructions about the trainings or how you can be talking to hard to count communities. Thank you for the work of locals in Pasadena, talking to neighbors.
Thanks, Chap. Norma, I'm wondering if you have any specifics for folks about how they can help with the 2020 census?
Yes, we at Planned Parenthood, Pasadena, San Gabriel Valley, we're also, we did have to pivot a lot of our outreach, I think, as most organizations did. We had lots of events kind of scheduled, and we had to pivot to primarily digital outreach. And so if you visit our social media pages on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, you will see links, you will see phone numbers about how to support the census. It would be great if you all could also repost those on your own pages. That would be very helpful to continue to just disseminate that information, disseminate the message. In spite of our stay-at-home order, a lot of people are sitting home who are used to being very active in their communities and who really care about these kinds of issues. And so a lot of us are kind of sitting on our hands, feeling kind of anxious that there's a lot of important work that still needs to get done. And so this is a really good way we're kind of now corralled into the digital space as our primary way to reach each other. And so by sharing posts and just kind of keeping and following our pages, that would be very helpful. We are also planning text banks and possible phone banks using our affiliate, like our Norma volunteers who are still engaged and who would still like to do this work. We're developing toolkits and making sure that the texting messages that go out are informative, that they're useful, that people can click on things. And so, yeah, if you're interested in any details about how to volunteer, you can email me at norma.rodriguez@pppsgv.org. Hopefully somehow we can type my email in there.
Yes.
It would be great if folks can volunteer with us as well. And lastly, we're also sending out emails to our supporter lists with vital information as well that's easy to use and clickable. And so that's kind of where we're at with our outreach.
Thank you, Norma. And I'm wondering if you can, at this time in the chat, go ahead and type in your email address so folks have access to that. Chap, that goes for you as well. If you can enter your email address in the chat function so folks can see it and contact you as needed. Kim, I want to ask you the question as well. And at this time, I would love to put up on the screen so folks can see the real-time map of Pasadena and how many folks have participated to date. And the last data came in on the 27th, so it's about 2 days old. But Kim, as you speak, I would love to share this information with folks so that they have a sense of how Pasadena is doing.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a great website, and when Juliana gets it up, you'll see the hard to count areas are a darker orange or a darker color, and it's pretty easy to tell where the freeway goes through, and then from there, and you can look at that data by congressional district, by city, and by census tract. So as Norma and Chap pointed out, I mean, we're kind of, we have to make it work on social media. We have to do what we can on social media. So boosting and sharing any and all census notices that you see. Another idea is record yourself or record family members talking about the census, what it means to them, the difference, some of the funding that comes from the census, from the programs that use the census data would be helpful, or even just talking about what it was like to actually fill it out, and get relatives and whoever's in your household perhaps to do little videos, PSAs, and put them up in social media, and do that right now. Obviously, and Norma spoke to this, once the shutdown is lifted, is reaching out to your network that where you volunteer or where you would like to make the commitment to participate in outreach will be very important, because we only have until August 14th right now to make up for what we weren't able to do in March and April. The data, the screenshot is showing the response rate, the volunteer or the individual response rate for towns, and Pasadena now is 32.8% response rate, so we've got a ways to go. Overall, I guess for the self-response, that's the word, it's almost 42% for the nation at large, so we have to catch up with that. But you can make a game of it too, because you can go down to census tract, so you can figure out where you are or where your friends are and say, hey, let's compete with each other. Who can have the highest response rate? Because the census needs the communities to get as close to 100%, obviously, but get close to 80% before they have to send out the enumerators, the door-to-door canvassers who go and actually ask the questions at the door. And their time is going to be limited, so we've got to make the most of it. And so this is just a real fun tool to look at and use in communicating with your community.
Thanks, Kim. All right, so we just have about a minute. Oh my gosh, time flew by way too fast. I want to address something that's come up a couple of times via the question and answer section about homeless persons. How do homeless persons get counted? Chap, I think you addressed this in terms of some of the outreach workers that will specifically be going out into parts of the community to reach homeless persons. Can you, Chap, maybe elaborate on that about how homeless people get counted as part of the census?
Yeah. I think there's an important distinction for all of us to know. None of us kind of count anyone else. We all educate and provide access to people to fill out the form for themselves. The only people that can count others are the Census Bureau themselves. They do go through that process of group enumeration. So any kind of large population, whether it's senior center, living centers, group homes, unhoused community populations, that all happens in kind of a large group enumeration frame. There's also a count that happens over a 3-day period where the Bureau works with the existing LA County count. There are some nonprofits that are working to try to identify where those groups exist, but all of those efforts happen through the nonprofit partnerships at the We Count LA level. So those groups have been working with the Bureau at a very high level. As individuals and as faith community members, as activists or groups of these groups talking to citizens, our job is to talk about education and why it's important, and to encourage folks to interact with the Bureau or to go on and enumerate themselves where they can. If you can bring a tablet to people, that's part of what some organizations are doing, but doing that individually isn't necessary, because there's a very effective kind of process that plays out through that.
Great, thank you. And then just one final question, which I think is a really interesting one. And so I'm just gonna open it up to all three of you, if any of you happen to know the answer. And it's in regards to having already completed the census, but now there is a family member that is being cared for as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Is there a way to go back and now account for this additional person in the household that will be there for a significant period of time? Do any of you have an answer for that?
I don't have an answer. I know so much of the Census Bureau schedule changed. And so I know that whoever is living in the house on April 1st, which is, what are we, like a day or two away from April 1st? So if your loved one is in the house on April 1st, whether or not they normally stay there, they should be counted in your census survey. And as for someone who came in after you've submitted your response, my best answer is to call the Census Bureau and ask directly in that phone number that I've seen pop up a few times in the chat. That would probably be my best guess, to make sure that that additional person is counted.
Okay, thank you.
I would add, I would say err on the side of getting the person counted, and then let the Census Bureau decide whether, if they want to call and reconfirm. And you can only use that census ID once in responding, but another household member, and this could happen definitely with non-family member households, if a subtenant, let's say, got left out accidentally, or they weren't sure whether they were included, they simply just go and fill it out with their address. And then it's, my understanding, it's up to the Census Bureau to aggregate as appropriate or call and follow up if they have questions.
There is a process for that aggregation to be cleaned up on duplicates. So our recommendation would be to go ahead and redo it with that person and let that data get cleaned up on the back end.
Okay. Well, we have run a bit over time, but I think this conversation was incredibly informative. So I want to give my sincere thanks to Chap and to Norma and to Kim for giving us part of your Sunday morning. I really appreciate all of the answers that you provided and your encouragement for us all to participate in the 2020 census. I'm very grateful for you all and the work that you're doing in our community. And I will say this, without a doubt, that the All Saints community is here to support you in the work that you do for both the census and with your respective organizations. And I hope that we can continue the partnerships that we have. I want to remind everyone that this week's action, which will be announced as part of our worship service that will be coming up shortly and will also be available on our website, is directly linked to the census. As we talked about a little bit earlier, the undocumented members of our community are particularly worried about their participation in the census. As such, we want to urge the Department of Homeland Security that they cease performing all of their immigration and deportation efforts for the duration of the census in order to ensure that undocumented members are feeling safe as they participate in this national survey. So you can participate in that action with the link that will be available shortly. You can just go to our website and click in the search function action, or type in, I should say, action, and you can find our weekly actions in that manner. It's a wonderful way for you to make your voice known, and we encourage you to do that. There are already some of you who are on hold waiting for our children's chapel, which is going to be starting in just about 10 minutes. And so we're going to conclude our forum. Thanks again to our panelists. Thanks so much to I see now we have 166 participants in this Zoom, which is absolutely wonderful. We hope to continue this work of having conversations before our weekly worship services online. So thanks for everyone who participated in this first try-on, and I'll see you all soon. Thanks, Chap, Norma, and Kim. Really grateful for you. Thank you very much.